You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Marin Katusa, author of the New York Times bestseller The Colder War and CEO of Katusa Research. Welcome to the show, Marin.
Always a pleasure.
Taking a look at what's happening in Syria, I've heard from my sources in 2 weeks, the Russian bombing has done more against ISIS than over a year of bombing done by the U.S.
You know, it's interesting that you bring that up. The word I'm hearing right now is within a week, the Americans and the Russians will announce an MOU regarding the fly zone, and it's specifically based on that they recognize that what Putin and the Russian military have done in conjunction with the Syrian-backed army of Assad's have done more damage to fight the terrorists than the Americans in the last year and a half. So, you know, a key element here that people do not understand in the West is many of the ISIS soldiers are mercenaries. And a mercenary is based off of who pays me the most I will fight for. They fight for cash. They do not fight for belief. They do not fight for their own dream. They fight for money. And a big problem that Americans had was they were trying to train what became mercenaries, arm them, train them under their military, and then basically were offered more money to go fight in ISIS. Hence why the last training coup of the American, the locals, the indigenous people there, ended up converting, taking their equipment, and now joining ISIS because they do it for pay. Now it's different than what we view as mercenaries in, the ex-French Foreign Legion guys that, go become into, security or those types of mercenaries. These are, what I call grassroots mercenaries, and they're basically just trying to fight much cheaper than what it costs the American military to fight. So, unfortunately for the Americans, they armed them, they trained them, and they lost them to ISIS for a higher pay, which the Americans didn't do because they're mercenaries. The Russians took it a different approach. And look, the Russians didn't hide that they were not just bombing ISIS, they were bombing other terrorist groups to Assad's regime. The Americans didn't like that, but the Americans can't deny that what the Russians are doing has been successful.
In other words, they're bringing peace to the area simply the way a war usually works. One side gets pounded to dust.
Well, I wouldn't call it peace, but there's an outcome. We're closer to an outcome here, and it is exactly what you stated. The outcome is ultimately peace, but I think we're still away from that. I think there's just so much animosity. There's so many factors being played. The Middle East is such a convoluted, complex place, and you still have the Iranian factor between Saudi Arabia, the white elephant, the Sunni between the animosity between the Shia and the Sunnis. This is a very complicated place.
If they create a no-fly zone, won't that help the terrorist groups?
Well, they wouldn't create a no-fly zone. They would have an understanding of the fly zone. Basically, it's an out for the Americans to accept what Putin is doing. Because Putin's done this all against the Americans', acceptance or approval. He doesn't recognize this as needing Americans' approval. This is the Russians throwing out an olive branch for the Americans so the Obama's administration can save face.
Right. So what exactly would this agreement say or do?
What I'm being told from my sources is it would be an understanding of what type of fly zone it would be. It wouldn't be a no-fly zone, which the Americans proposed in the past. It would be very different. It would be, remember, according to what the Russians approve. And really this is just going to be that, okay, the Russians will handle this quadrant, the Americans will handle the other quadrant, and they'd have an understanding of how to move forward together. But there's no such thing as a no-fly zone anymore in the Middle East.
Well, if they're going to assign quadrants, it looks like whatever quadrant the U.S. gets is going to be the one that'll be the least effective against terrorism, if the Russians can do this in 2 weeks.
The Russians aren't finished yet, but they've gone strong, and they're going to continue to go strong. But more importantly, this isn't, in my opinion, the MOU that is going to be signed isn't about the Americans being effective or not. It's a way for the Americans to save face to the UN. It's a way for the U.S. to save face to NATO. It's a way for the American administration under Obama to save face to his own nation. That's what the MOU is about. think about it. They're going to now negotiate with the Russians on an MOU when the Russians have gone and done what they want to do. Do the Russians really care what the Americans have to say? They're just doing this to appease the Americans.
Well, that's kind of strange because, of course, the Americans never do anything to appease the Russians.
Correct. But I think if you look at what Putin's comments are, and I go into great detail in my book, he's got a mission here and he's moving forward, and the Russians have played this well. They've won this, so they see as throwing on an olive branch to the Americans will only make them look better. So, it's been a massive power struggle. Obama's lost. Putin has won. And I expect our media will find out about this in the next 10 to 12 days. There's a scoop for you.
Well, always. That's why we talk to you, Marin. Where is Putin going to go next? He's dipped his finger into Ukraine. He's come in and pretty well mastered the situation in Syria. What's his next step?
I don't know if he's mastered the situation in Syria. He's come to defense of his beliefs, of his foreign policy, and he'll continue. I believe this is what he will do. He does not meddle in foreign policy. He does not believe that another foreign country should meddle in the politics of the region, like what the Americans have done. So he is not going to go and now trying to do a coup in Saudi Arabia or in Iran or Iraq or anything like that. I don't see him doing that. What I see him doing is putting a foothold in the Middle East to make sure that Russia is recognized as a superpower, and any deals done with any Russian companies, people recognize that it's backed by the Russian administration. That's what I believe this is all about, and it's very important for Russia to continue with the Chinese, the massive expansion. The world's largest construction projects in the planet are still the pipeline that no one seems to be talking about. This is more than just about foreign policy. It's about long-term contracts for oil, gas, nuclear energy.
We'll have more with Marin Katusa right after the break.
More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600.
Welcome back. We're talking to Marin Katusa. Marin, what is the Chinese goal by taking part with the Russians in Syria?
Well, as I detail in my book, the Russians have voted alongside the Russians against the Americans since Putin's been in power. They've lined themselves up with the Russians, which is surprising to the Americans, but that's how it's played out. Again, the Chinese follow the leadership of Putin on this. They don't want to meddle in the Middle East. And really what I see happening is Putin is expanding in the Middle East. China has the strength in the South Sea. That's very important to the Chinese. And Putin won't mingle in that area. And they've kind of chopped up their regions so that Chinese will back Putin in the Middle East and his agenda there. And the Russians will back China on the South China Sea. They work together. And there's also military contracts between the two. There's a lot of tension between the two also, but they recognize that they have to work together to displace the American superpower in the U.S. So what was key that no one was talking about, when the yuan was devalued, it happened a week before the American Fed met, and they basically played the hand for America. They appreciated the American currency by devaluing the yuan, hence interest rates couldn't go up. So it'll be interesting. Everyone's focusing on what the Fed's doing. I state to people, focus on the dragon. What will the dragon do has effects on what the U.S. Fed will do. So that's what's going on between the Chinese right now. Remember, 1/3 of all the debt the Americans owe is to the Chinese. So they're very, wouldn't you want your debt dollars that you own to be worth lots and your own currency to go down because you're selling stuff to the world? So there's a lot of games being played here that are very complex.
And of course, I mean, China doesn't want to hurt the U.S. economy, I wouldn't think, with the U.S. being their biggest customer.
Of course. And, actually the EU is China's biggest customer. So if you combine the EU together as one group, they're the biggest customer. But the second, they're no doubt the largest single nation is the U.S. And with a strong dollar, they can buy more trinkets and goods from the Chinese, which is important because the Chinese own so many dollars. For example, a lot of people don't know that in the month of August, the Chinese sold 10% of all their U.S. dollars quietly into the market. That's a huge move.
And yet the U.S. currency continues to be strong but hasn't lost value lately.
Correct.
I mean, that's why the Canadian dollar's gone up. I think it isn't because Canada's done anything spectacular.
No, but it's relatively speaking. In 2011, our dollar was par with the Americans. Even this morning, it's still, roughly $1.30. So, we've lost a lot of ground in Canada on our dollar, and the yuan, because it's fixed to the U.S. dollar, has appreciated significantly. So the key to China is they were really upset that the IMF didn't include them in the currency basket, so they said, okay, we'll devalue. So we stay competitive. Remember, there's a currency war going on.
This is very complicated when you throw politics into that as well, right?
Politics, economics, it's a fascinating time for geopolitics.
What's this Russia-China partnership going to do to energy prices?
Well, interestingly enough, a lot of people, like I said on your show a year ago, my book, Oil Can Stay Lower for Longer. Goldman Sachs made that famous. I wrote about it a year ago. They made it famous just recently, that title, Lower for Longer. I love it when a big firm makes something that I wrote a year ago famous. But anyways, you're going to continue to see that moving forward. But the Russians are playing a 50-year plan here. The Americans are playing a 50-year plan here. Who's the largest shareholder of Rosneft? Who's the largest shareholder of Gazprom? It's the Russian government. When you look at who's the largest shareholder of Exxon or Chevron, it's not the American government. So you got to remember that the Russians are playing a very different game. In the West here, when the companies are doing it, they play on a quarterly basis, which is every 3 months. The Russians, they're planning out in decades, and they have oil wells because their currency is devalued significantly. Their cost of production, when they're selling in U.S. dollars or in euros, has decreased. So to them, it's been the same net, no different than a Canadian copper or gold producer or an oil producer. A weak Canadian dollar is what's keeping the resource sector in Canada alive, and a lot of people don't understand that. A strong dollar, when your currency stays strong and your commodity crashes, that's a recipe for the Dutch disease, which means you're in big problems because now you're selling for less, but your currency is strong. Now you can't compete in an international basis. But when your currency crashes and your commodity crashes, but you're selling in a strong U.S. dollar, you can survive. So it's going to take some time for the emerging markets to get their development going, and that's why China and Russia are working on these long-term strategies. They're going to do just fine. You look at Russia's at all-time high for oil production. Believe it or not, China is at all-time high oil production. People forget that the Chinese produce about 5.5 million barrels a day. They've got a great sector going, and they're improving significantly, and you'll see more improvements as the Russians and Chinese work together there. Now, in the U.S., we've dropped off maybe about 400,000 or 500,000 barrels, but we're pretty still close to the all-time high. So the sector will continue where there's an oversupply of oil, and it will stay that way.
Well, in China, we find all these dinosaur bones. It seems to me anywhere where you find dinosaur bones, you find oil. Look at Alberta.
Well, it's a bit more complex than that, but, the Chinese have vast shale potential. They've got vast unconventional potential. And, when you asked about where the future for China and Russia is, a big one's going to be nuclear energy. And that's a key component to China's matrix. They are struggling from the air apocalypse, as I coined it 2 years ago. When I went and gave talks in Beijing, hell, even in Hong Kong, the atmosphere, the air is so polluted. It was hard to do a run. It was just awful. And they have the highest asthma rates in the world. They have a serious pollution because they recognize they can't depend on coal. They're making serious changes, and nuclear energy is a key component of that.
Yet I don't see anything for the Chinese government to discourage their population from smoking.
Well, that's a very different aspect, and, they're kind of there where the Americans were in the 40s and 50s and 60s, where, it's almost glamorous to smoke. It's interesting how times and places can change, but the pattern stays similarly throughout the different nations. History, it definitely doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, as Mark Twain said.
It's an interesting saying. Well, I thought the reason the Japanese government has the monopoly on the tobacco industry is that they want you to die before you can collect your old age pension.
I don't know about that, but it sounds like a good conspiracy theory.
Well, that's what we do on these shows, it seems, and so often we're right. who would think that the Chinese and Russians, who have had wars, minor wars on their borders, by the way, in recent history, and like you said, they don't always get along, but they seem to share the same long-term goals.
Well, they share the common enemy, and the enemy of my friend, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So I think that single-handedly they cannot take on America, and that was the thesis of my book. But under the direction of what Putin's laid down, you see that they're working together, that China, Russia, the other emerging markets, and they recognize that they have to do this. And then when they actually dethrone America, then you'll see more chaos, because then who will be the superpower? That's the next battle. But we're years away of that. Right now, it's a battle between America, backed by what I call aging or museum nations like Japan, the UK, the EU, versus the emerging markets led by Russia and China.
And of course, the Americans have done so much to make themselves loved around the world.
Exactly. You go around the world, and I've traveled to over 100 countries, and you just see the distrust of Americans and American companies. Sadly, when you look at a lot of the big oil deposits and fields, around the world, they were discovered and developed by Americans and American companies. And it's been nationalized from them, and more importantly, there's so much distrust and animosity towards the Americans. So in an ironic twist of fate, these nations wouldn't have what they have today if it wasn't for the American spirit and innovation and entrepreneurship, but it's exactly that they detest so much.
Mm-hmm. Or you look at India, they hate the British, but without the British, they'd have no phones and no railways.
Well, or it'd be different in some form. Maybe it would be someone else. Maybe it would be the Dutch, or maybe it would be the Americans.
It's always somebody.
It's always someone.
Marin, thank you very much for chatting with us.
It's always a pleasure. Take care.
My guest has been Marin Katusa, author of the New York Times bestseller The Colder War and CEO of Katusa Research. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Comments about the show can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.